Today, we're going to explore 3 chilling true crime cases involving serial offenders. Let's begin with the first one. The officers had searched the house. Room by room, they were nearly done when one of them pressed his hand against a wooden panel in the trophy room and felt it shift. A hidden compartment opened. Inside, they find weapons, newspaper clippings about missing women, identification cards belonging to people no one had seen in years, jewelry that did not belong to anyone in this house, and a map, an aviation map of the Anchorage region, marked with 24 handwritten asterisks scattered across the Alaskan wilderness. 4 of those marks matched exactly where investigators had already recovered the bodies of 4 women. 20 marks had no body attached to them yet. The man who drew that map had a wife and 2 children. He ran a bakery on the corner of 9th and Ingra. He held world records in bow hunting and was known at his church as generous and dependable. His neighbors had no reason to think otherwise. He had been operating for over a decade, and he had done it in plain sight. To understand how that was possible, you have to go back to the beginning, to a small town in Iowa, and a boy the world kept rejecting. Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939, in Estherville, Iowa. His parents were Danish immigrants who worked hard and expected the same from their children. His father was strict and deeply religious. His mother was softer, more nurturing, but her influence rarely outweighed the rigid household his father controlled. From early childhood, Robert was different in ways that made his life difficult. He was naturally left-handed, but his father forced him to write and work with his right hand, a common practice at the time, but one that added confusion and frustration to a child already struggling. He developed a severe stutter that followed him throughout his school years, making every classroom interaction a source of anxiety and embarrassment. Then came the acne. By his teenage years, Robert's face was severely marked by deep acne scarring that left visible pockmarks across his skin. In a school environment where appearance and social belonging mean everything, this made him a target. Classmates mocked him. Girls turned him away. He asked someone to a dance. She laughed. He tried again. He was rejected again. Year after year, the same pattern. Robert retreated from people and moved toward the wilderness. He became an exceptional marksman, first with rifles, then with a bow. He spent long hours alone in fields and forests, practicing, honing a skill that rewarded patience and precision, rather than charm or social confidence. Hunting gave him something school and community never did: the feeling of being capable, the feeling of being in control. He graduated in 1957 and enlisted in the Army Reserve, completing basic training at Fort Dix in New Jersey. It was during this period that he had his first encounter with a woman in a sexual context, a disappointing and transactional experience in New York City that left him feeling no less isolated than before. After his service, he returned to Iowa. He worked in his father's bakery. He took a job as a drill instructor at a local police academy. And for a brief moment, life seemed to be moving forward. He married a young woman and began building something that resembled a normal life. But the resentment he had carried since childhood had never gone away. It had only gone quiet. In 1960, Robert's mask slipped for the first time. He set fire to the Pocahontas County Board of Education bus barn. It was a deliberate act of destruction aimed at a system he believed had failed and humiliated him. He was caught, arrested, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. His wife divorced him. His parents shut down the bakery and moved to Minnesota to escape the embarrassment. Robert served less than 2 years before being released on parole, despite prison evaluations diagnosing him with manic depression, periodic schizophrenic episodes, and what was described as an infantile personality, marked by a compulsive need to seek revenge on those he felt had wronged him. After his release, Robert drifted through a series of low-paying bakery jobs and continued to accumulate minor criminal charges. But then something changed. He went to stay at his parents' lake resort in Leech Lake, Minnesota, and there he met Darla. Darla was a college student working at the resort for the summer. She was devoutly religious, kind, and apparently saw in Robert something worth believing in. They spent hours together on the lake, talking, rowing, falling into the comfortable rhythm of two people who had found each other. By the end of the season, they were in love. After she finished her studies, she agreed to marry him. In 1967, Robert and Darla relocated to Anchorage, Alaska. They would go on to have 2 children. Robert found work as a baker and as a longshoreman on the Anchorage docks. Darla became a teacher working with children who had special needs. From every outward angle, they were a solid, respectable family living a good Alaskan life. And for the people around them, that was all they ever saw. What no one around Robert could see was that Alaska had not healed him. It had simply given him more space. In the late 1960s and through the 1970s, Robert's hunting skills reached a level that earned him a place in the Pope and Young Association's World Record Book, an organization that tracks exceptional archery hunting achievements. He proudly displayed his trophies. He was celebrated by the outdoor community as a skilled and dedicated sportsman. But privately, the same impulses that had driven him to burn down that bus barn in Iowa, the desire for control, for revenge, for power over something, were growing darker and more specific. Anchorage, in this era, had a notorious area known as the Tenderloin District, concentrated around 4th Avenue and controlled largely by organized crime. The discovery of oil in Alaska had brought a massive surge in workers, money, and transient population. Young women were drawn to the city by the promise of substantial earnings at clubs with names like the Wild Cherry Bar, the Arctic Fox, and the Great Alaskan Bush Company. Between the clubs were peep shows and underground markets for illegal content. Violence was a daily occurrence. It was here, in this chaotic and largely lawless environment, that Robert found his earliest victims. Women who were desperate for money, willing to accept offers of a few $100s for companionship or photographs. Women who were transient, who had limited connections in the city, who would not immediately be noticed as missing. Robert knew exactly what he was doing. He chose them deliberately. In November 1971, a young secretary named Susan Hoppard was sitting at a red light on Northern Lights Boulevard when she became aware of a man in the adjacent car staring at her. She offered a brief, polite smile, the kind anyone might offer, and drove on to her apartment in the Spenard neighborhood. That evening, as she was preparing to shower, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found a man in glasses and a bright orange hunting cap. He said he was looking for a friend who lived in the building, claimed he had the wrong address, and asked if he could use her phone. Susan agreed. He came inside, nervously flipped through her phone book, and then asked her on a date. She declined, telling him she was engaged. He made awkward small talk and left. She thought that was the end of it. About a week later, Susan left her apartment early in the morning to drive some friends to work. When she returned and walked back to her car, the same man appeared from nowhere and threatened her with gun. He ordered her to stay silent. She screamed. Her roommate heard the noise, opened the door, and shouted that she was calling the police. Robert fled. When officers arrived, they found him walking in the snow nearby. He matched the description. A quick search found the weapon on him. He was arrested and charged with assault with a deadly weapon. When questioned, he told investigators he had felt dizzy and could not recall the events of that morning. He was released until trial. On December 25, 1971, brothers Gary and Dennis Lawler were driving south on the Seward Highway, following the shoreline of Turnagain Arm, planning to photograph the Alaskan wilderness. They stopped at the McHugh Creek Recreation Area in Chugach State Park, setting up near a small ledge to photograph a waterfall. As Dennis steadied his camera, something caught his eye. Partially hidden behind a bush, just 10 feet in front of him, was what looked like a mannequin beneath a light covering of snow. It was a deceased young woman, partially unclothed. Sergeant Walter Gilmore of the Alaska State Troopers arrived at the scene. The victim was a young blonde woman. Her hands were tied and she had been restrained. She quickly matched the description of Celia Beth Van Zanten, an 18-year-old who had been reported missing 2 days earlier on her way to a local store. The examination of the scene revealed something deeply disturbing. Beth had been assaulted, she had a fatal wound, and she had been alive when she went into the ravine. Evidence suggested she had tried repeatedly to climb out of the icy gorge, but with her hands tied, she could not pull herself up. She fell back again and again into the freezing darkness until the cold ended her life. In the parking lot near the scene, tire tracks looped in wide circular patterns, suggesting her attacker had driven back and forth, searching for her after she escaped into the ravine, waiting for her to resurface. Rain began to fall before investigators could fully process the scene, washing away evidence. Over the following 2 days, Sergeant Gilmore pursued every lead. Then a breakthrough arrived. A respected state trooper contacted him with an informant who could help. His own 18-year-old daughter, Sandra Patterson. Sandra had been working the streets to support a heroin addiction, and she came forward because of what she had heard about Beth. On the night of December 19th, a man had threatened her at gunpoint in the parking lot of the Nevada Club. Slender, mid-30s, horn-rimmed glasses. He bound her hands and drove her south on the Seward Highway, stopping at a motel in Cooper Landing before taking her deeper into the wilderness. Sandra stayed calm throughout, keeping him from escalating, and eventually convinced him to release her. Before he did, he told her he had already harmed other women and warned her to stay silent. When she heard about Beth, she came forward anyway. She told Gilmore everything he threatened, he followed through on. Every word he said about what he had done. She believed it, and if a young woman had gone missing in the same area at the same time, she believed it was him. Investigators showed her a photo lineup. Without hesitation, she pointed to Robert Hansen. Robert Hansen was in the lineup because just a month earlier, he had been arrested for the attack on Susan Hoppard. He was already facing trial for that crime. When brought in for questioning about Sandra's account, he denied everything. With only Sandra's testimony against him, and given that she was a young woman working the streets with a history of addiction, investigators ultimately decided she was not a reliable enough witness. Her case was dropped entirely. With no additional physical evidence linking Robert to Beth's death, he was released. By the time his trial for the attack on Susan Hoppard reached the courtroom, in March 1972, Robert had successfully convinced the judge that the incident had been caused by a dissociative episode brought on by his manic depression. He was sentenced to 3 to 5 years in prison. He was paroled in November 1973, having served less than 2. Darla stayed with him throughout. She later said her religious beliefs made her feel she could fix him. She knew he had been seeing prostitutes. She had no idea what he was actually doing. What followed Robert's release from prison in 1973 was more than a decade of carefully concealed violence, enabled by Alaska's vast wilderness, a transient victim population, and a community that had no reason to suspect the quiet baker who attended church and sold pastries at the corner of 9th and Ingra. Robert purchased a Piper Super Cub aircraft without ever obtaining a pilot's license, and began flying women to a secluded cabin he owned deep in the backcountry. His pattern was consistent. He would approach a woman in the Tenderloin district, offering money. Once she was isolated with him, he would produce a weapon. He would take her to his plane and fly her to the cabin, where he would attack and terrorize her. Some women survived. Others were taken into wilderness, partially undressed and blindfolded. He would give them a short head start. Then he would purse them through wilderness. He later described it to investigators in hunting terms. He compared his victims to doll sheep and grizzly bears. In some instances, he would allow a woman to believe she had escaped, only to track her down again, forcing her to run once more, prolonging the ordeal until she had nothing left. He would cause her death using a firearm or blade. He returned clothing to the victims afterward, telling investigators later that it was a way of maintaining control, like keeping a trophy. In 1976, Robert was caught stealing a chainsaw from a Fred Meyer store in Anchorage. Due to his prior record, he was sentenced to 5 years. The Alaska Supreme Court later overturned this as excessive. He was released again, his bipolar disorder now being managed with lithium, prescribed by psychiatrists. He was free to continue. In January 1981, using $13,000 from a fraudulent insurance claim for a staged home burglary, Robert opened a new bakery. He bought a newer Piper Super Cub. He had prominent friends through his Lutheran church. He donated to community causes, and he kept hunting. Construction workers digging near Eklutna Lake Road in July 1980 discovered the remains of a woman in a shallow grave. The remains had been badly affected by the environment. There was almost no evidence at the scene. A facial reconstruction was completed and circulated, but no one came forward to identify her. She became known only as Eklutna Annie, a name without a history, a victim without a family to claim her. She would remain unidentified. Later that same year, a second body was found in a gravel pit near the same area. This victim was identified as Joanna Messina, a topless dancer. Her body had been concealed in a gravel pit. The cause of death was a gunshot wound. The body was too decomposed to gather meaningful evidence. Investigators had two bodies, no clear connection between them, and no suspects. On September 12, 1982, two off-duty Anchorage police officers were hunting in the Nick River Valley, about 25 miles outside the city. They spotted something unusual in the sand along the riverbank, a boot protruding from the ground. They moved closer. Beneath the sand was a partial human remain still attached to the boot. They noted the location without disturbing it and reported back to their station. When a full team arrived, investigators carefully worked through the site. The victim's face had been wrapped in an ace bandage, almost as if she had been blindfolded. Among the evidence recovered was a .223 caliber bullet casing, commonly used in high-powered rifles. The autopsy confirmed the victim was female, dead for approximately 6 months, and had sustained multiple gunshot wounds. Strangely, although the body was fully clothed when found, evidence suggested she was redressed after death, indicating the victim had been unclothed when the shots were fired, and someone had dressed her again afterward. 2 weeks later, the victim was formally identified as Sherry Morrow, 24 years old, a dancer at the Wild Cherry Bar in Anchorage. She had last been seen on November 17, 1981. Friends said she had told them she was meeting a man who had offered her $300 to pose for photographs. Police had already been quietly noting an unusual rise in missing persons reports over the previous 2 years, many of them dancers and sex workers. Now, with a confirmed case of homicide involving the same population, investigators began to ask whether something larger was happening. Sergeant Glenn Flowes was assigned to review the existing case files for any pattern. That evening, Robert Yunt was driving his truck toward downtown Anchorage, passing Merrill Field, one of the busiest small airports in the world, when he saw a young woman running barefoot toward his vehicle. She was handcuffed and calling for help. Behind her, a man armed with a gun had been chasing her. When he saw the truck stop, he turned and fled back toward the airfield. The woman climbed into the truck, barely able to speak through her fear. She asked to be taken to her motel. Yun dropped her there and drove directly to the Anchorage Police Department. Officer Greg Baker arrived at the motel to find the young woman, Cindy Paulson, 17 years old, still shaking as he helped remove her handcuffs. Cindy told Officer Baker what had happened. A man in his 40s with reddish hair had approached her on the street, offering $200. During the encounter, he had locked a handcuff to her wrist and pressed a weapon to her head, telling her would harm her if she made a sound. He drove her to his home and took her inside to his basement, which was filled with hunting trophies mounted across every wall. He secured her to a support pillar. For hours, he subjected her to hours of violence. Afterward, he drove her to Merrill Field Airport. He told her he was going to fly her to his cabin in the Alaskan wilderness. He said he had taken many women there before. He said she would be released if she cooperated with everything he demanded. At the airport, as he unloaded supplies from his vehicle into the plane, Cindy saw her window. She pushed open the aircraft door and ran. He chased her until she flagged down the truck. At Anchorage's Humana Hospital, medical staff documented bruising and shackle marks around her neck and wrists, consistent with her account. She provided detailed descriptions of her attacker's home, his car, his plane, and his physical appearance. Investigators took Cindy to Merrill Field. It was a small airport. She quickly identified the plane, a blue and white Piper Super Cub. The registration led back to Robert Hansen. Officer Baker and his team arrived at Robert's home in Muldoon early the following morning. Robert was cooperative. He agreed to come to the station. When confronted with Cindy's account, he denied it entirely, providing an alibi. He said he had been with two friends, John Sumrall and John Henning, at the time of the alleged incident. Both men confirmed his story. A search of Robert's home and vehicle turned up no direct physical evidence tying him to Cindy's case. Investigators did find ace bandages and a box of .223 caliber shell casings in his car, but this was not considered enough. They searched his plane at Merrill Field. Nothing incriminating was found. Robert was released. Some of Baker's colleagues struggled to accept that a well-known local businessman, a church-going family man with a good reputation, could be capable of what Cindy described. There was open skepticism about Cindy's account, given her background as a transient and her criminal record. But Officer Baker believed her completely. He gathered every piece of information he had collected on Robert and walked it over to the Alaska State Troopers, hoping they would act where his own department had not. On September 2nd, 1983, two hunters discovered a partially decomposed body along the Kinnick River, buried in a shallow grave. Alaska State Troopers arrived and determined the victim had been shot with a .223 caliber round. Dental records confirmed the victim as Paula Goulding, 30 years old, a topless dancer and sex worker from Anchorage who had been missing for the previous 5 months. She had been shot in the same manner as Sherry Morrow. Like Sherry, her body had been redressed after her death. It was now difficult to argue these were unrelated incidents. Investigators formally acknowledged they were likely dealing with a single offender responsible for multiple deaths. A task force was established, led by Sergeant Floth. Because Anchorage had recently struggled with another serious case involving a dangerous offender who had taken his own life before being apprehended, Sergeant Floth chose to bring in outside expertise. He requested FBI assistance. Special Agent John Douglas was one of the founding members of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit and a pioneer of criminal profiling. Working from the case evidence, he built a picture of the offender, an experienced hunter, physically marked in some way, with deep-rooted resentment toward women and a history of rejection. Someone who targeted dancers and sex workers because they were transient and less likely to be reported missing. someone who kept personal items from his victims to relive what he had done. Then Sergeant Floth found the sealed envelope Officer Baker had submitted months earlier. Cindy Paulson's account and her identification of Robert Hansen. When they placed Robert's background against the profile, the match was exact. World record hunter, severe facial scarring from childhood acne, a documented stutter, a recorded history of targeting this same group of women, 2 prior accusations from 2 different survivors describing near identical conduct. The profile and the man were the same person. Acting on Douglas's guidance, Sergeant Floth brought John Sumrall and John Henning in for questioning again, this time with the explicit warning that if they were found to have lied to investigators, they would face criminal charges. Almost immediately, both men admitted they had not been with Robert on the night Cindy described. They said they thought they were covering for him in what they assumed was a personal matter, a marital issue perhaps. They had no idea what they had actually been protecting him from. The alibi was gone. Floth still needed a search warrant. He reviewed Robert's files further and noticed that Robert had filed an insurance claim stating that hunting trophies had been stolen from his home in a burglary. But Floth had personally been inside that house. He had seen the trophies. The insurance claim was fraudulent. With the combination of Cindy's account, the collapsed alibi, Robert's documented prior offenses, the insurance fraud, and Douglas's detailed profile matching Robert on nearly every point, Floth was able to convince Judge Victor Carlson to authorize a series of search warrants. On October 27, 1983, Sergeant Floth and his team approached Robert at his bakery and asked him to accompany them to the station for questioning. Robert went without hesitation and without asking why. While Robert sat in an interview room, left alone for a time to observe his behavior through a 2-way mirror, officers executed the search at his home. His wife and children were present and had no warning. In the main areas of the house, investigators located several weapons, but they were about to conclude the search when one officer pressed against a wooden panel in the trophy room and felt it shift. The hidden compartment opened. Inside were additional firearms. There were newspaper clippings about the missing women cases. There were ACE bandages. There were pieces of jewelry that would later be matched to victims. There were identification documents belonging to missing women. And there was a folded aviation map of the Anchorage region, marked with 24 asterisks in handwriting that belonged to Robert Hansen. 4 of those marks matched precisely the locations where the remains of Sherry Morrow, Paula Goulding, Joanna Messina, and Eklutna Annie had been recovered. 20 more marks pointed to places no investigator had yet searched. At the police station, Robert was confronted with the evidence. He grew angry and refused to discuss the case without a lawyer. He was formally arrested and charged with assault, kidnapping, weapons violations, theft, and insurance fraud. Murder charges were not yet filed. Investigators were waiting for ballistic analysis. Robert pleaded not guilty on all counts in front of an Anchorage grand jury. His bail was set at $500,000. On November 20th, 1983, the results from the FBI's ballistics laboratory came back. The shell casings recovered at the crime scenes where Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding had been found matched. Robert's Ruger Mini 14 rifle with precision. Identical marks from the firing pin, and extractor confirmed it was the same weapon. The physical evidence was now overwhelming. By early 1984, Robert's attorney had assessed the situation honestly. With the ballistic match, the collapsed alibi, the hidden compartment evidence, the aviation map, and 2 prior recorded accusations from surviving victims, a trial would almost certainly result in conviction on multiple counts. On February 22, 1984, his attorney arranged a meeting with District Attorney Vic Crum and Sergeant Floth to negotiate a plea agreement. Robert confessed to the deaths of Sherry Morrow, Joanna Messina, Paula Goulding, and Eklutna Annie. In exchange for information about other victims, he was asking to be charged only with those 4 confirmed deaths, to serve his sentence in federal prison rather than a maximum security state facility, and to have his name kept out of the press. The deal was agreed to and finalized. With his fate now settled and nothing left to protect, Robert began to talk. Robert described his method in detail. He would approach women in the Tenderloin district, offering money. Once he had them isolated, he would produce a weapon. He would take them to his plane and fly them to his cabin in the backcountry, where he would attack them and terrorize them over a period of time. He told them that if a woman fully complied, he would release her. But if she resisted, he would take her outside. He would remove her clothing and blindfold her. He would tell her to run, giving her a small head start. Then he would follow. He compared it directly to hunting big game. He described the experience in the same language he used for pursuing Dall sheep or grizzly bears in the Alaskan wilderness. The challenge, the tracking, the patience. In some cases, he allowed a woman to believe she had gotten away, then found her and made her run again, extending the ordeal until she was too exhausted to continue. He told them he put clothing back to the victim afterward, which he later described as a part of his need for control. The same logic, he said, as preserving a hunting trophy. He claimed the killings had begun in the early 1970s. He denied involvement in the death of Celia Beth Van Zanten, the young woman found at McHugh Creek on Christmas Day, 1971. But investigators noted that her case closely resembled the pattern of his later crimes, and that one of the marks on his aviation map corresponded precisely to the location where her remains had been found. She is currently considered his probable first victim. In total, Robert was linked to the deaths of 17 women and to committing violent acts against more than 30 others. Following the confession, Robert was taken up in a military helicopter with a police escort to locate the grave sites marked on his map. Flying across the Alaskan wilderness, he directed investigators to each location, leading them on foot to the graves and pointing out where victims had been left. Investigators marked nearby trees with orange paint to identify each site for excavation once the heavy snowpack receded in spring. During this process, Robert's demeanor disturbed investigators deeply. Handcuffed, he would become visibly animated at some of the sites, eager, even excited, sometimes digging through snowdrifts with his hands to show investigators where he had buried a victim. He was reliving the experience as he walked them through it. By the end of the day, he had identified 12 sites that investigators had not previously known about. Robert pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Paula Goulding, Joanna Messina, Sherry Morrow, and Eklutna Annie. Under the terms of his plea agreement, he was not formally charged with the remaining 13 deaths he was connected to. During proceedings, Assistant District Attorney Frank Rothschild addressed the court. He described the man before them as someone who had lived among the community for 17 years, serving pastries and coffee with a pleasant expression, while carrying out crimes against women in the wilderness that most people could not bring themselves to fully imagine. Judge Ralph Moody sentenced Robert Hansen to 461 years in prison, plus life without the possibility of parole. By the end of 1984, investigators had recovered 7 additional victims from the grave sites Robert had identified during the helicopter tour. Despite his confession to 17 deaths and 24 marks on his personal map, no further remains beyond those 7 were recovered in that initial search. The scale of the Alaskan wilderness made comprehensive excavation extremely difficult. Areas that appeared accessible on an aviation map could be nearly impossible to work in at ground level, buried under feet of snowpack for months at a time, or located on terrain that required specialized access. Over the years that followed, hunters and outdoor workers occasionally came across partial remains in remote areas of the state. When this happened, investigators would contact Robert and ask whether the location corresponded to any of his victims. For a period after his initial cooperation, he occasionally provided information, but his cooperation did not last, and he eventually stopped engaging with investigators entirely. The full scope of what Robert Hansen had done in the wilderness of Alaska was never definitively established. Robert was transferred initially to the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, then returned to Alaska, where he became one of the first inmates at the newly opened Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward. Darla, his wife, initially attempted to remain in Alaska with their children after his conviction. After years of public harassment, she filed for divorce and left the state permanently. The Pope and Young Association, the bull hunting record organization in which Robert had achieved world record status, removed his name from their records entirely following his conviction. In 2014, Robert was transferred to the Anchorage Correctional Center to receive medical treatment. He died there later that year from natural causes. He was 75 years old. He took whatever remained of his full account with him. The official confirmed count of Robert Hansen's victims is 17, but many investigators and analysts who studied his case believe the true number is substantially higher. Sergeant Floth, who conducted the extended interrogations of Robert after his conviction, came away believing that Robert had likely been responsible for the deaths of 4 or 5 women every year from the early 1970s onward, a rate that, over 12 or more years, would place the real total far above 17. FBI experts have considered Robert Hansen among the most prolific offenders in American history. Some estimates of the potential victim count reach as high as 37. There is also the matter of what Robert told Sandra Patterson in December 1971, before Beth Van Zanten's body had even been found. He told Sandra he had already harmed many other women. If that account is accurate, then it raises a difficult question. Was Beth truly his first victim? Or had Robert Hansen been operating long before anyone in Alaska had reason to look? That question has never been answered. One of the most significant facts of this case is how many times law enforcement had Robert Hansen within reach before he was finally stopped. Sandra Patterson identified him in a photo lineup in early 1972. Her account was dismissed because of her background and occupation. Her case was dropped. Cindy Paulson escaped from him in June 1983, identified his plane, described his home accurately, and named him to investigators within hours. Her account was effectively set aside because of her background and a confirmed alibi that turned out to be fabricated. Both women were telling the truth. Both were disbelieved or deprioritized for the same reasons. The women Robert Hansen targeted, dancers, sex workers, women in financial desperation, were considered by some investigators and prosecutors to be less credible witnesses by default. That assumption cost lives. Officer Greg Baker, who believed Cindy Paulson when much of his own department did not, and who personally delivered her file to the Alaska State Troopers when he could not get his superiors to act, played a significant role in ultimately bringing the case together. His persistence in refusing to dismiss her account mattered. Robert Hansen's case became the basis for the 2013 film Frozen Ground, with John Cusack portraying Robert and Nicolas Cage playing an Alaskan state trooper working the investigation. The film brought wider attention to a case that, despite its scale and duration, has remained less prominent in public awareness than the cases of some other offenders from the same era. Part of that may be geography. Alaska occupies a place in the American imagination that feels more remote and mythological than states closer to population centers. Crimes that happen there feel somehow more distant, even when their human reality is as immediate and devastating as anything that has occurred anywhere else. For Robert, Alaska was exactly what he needed: vast space, a transient population, cold that erased evidence, a community that saw a hard-working baker and a committed church member and had no framework for imagining what he did when he flew north with a woman beside him in that small blue and white plane. For many of the women he targeted, Alaska became the final setting of the story. The women Robert Hansen harmed were real people with real lives. Their stories matter, and the system failures that allowed this to continue for over a decade deserve to be remembered. When someone vulnerable tells the truth, the response they receive should never depend on how respectable their life looks. That is not a small failure. It is a decision with consequences, and this case proves exactly what those consequences look like. If this case stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a case like this one. Stay aware, stay close to the people around you, and we will see you in the next one. Now, let's move on to the second horrifying serial killer story. On the morning of June 24th, 1998, an 81-year-old woman put on her finest dress and waited for her doctor to arrive. She had a luncheon to get to at 11. The visit was routine, a blood test, nothing more. She trusted this man completely. Her daughter later said she had told people more than once that whatever her doctor said, she simply said fine. By midday, her colleagues at the luncheon were wondering where she was. By late afternoon, they found her at home, seated on her sofa, fully dressed, looking as though she had simply drifted off. She had not. And she was not the first. She was not even close to the last. This is the story of Harold Shipman, the man every patient trusted with their life. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on June 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England, the second of 3 children in a working-class family living on a council estate that his mother Vera viewed as a temporary situation rather than a permanent address. Vera Shipman was the most powerful presence in Harold's early life, a woman who had decided that education was the only path out of their circumstances, and who directed that conviction almost entirely toward Harold, because he was the only one of her children who seemed to take it seriously. His older sister Pauline left school at 15. His younger brother Clive showed little academic ambition. Harold studied, listened, and did exactly what his mother asked of him. What Vera gave Harold was attention and belief. What she did not give him, without perhaps understanding the cost of it, was the freedom to develop normally alongside other children. She kept him separate from neighborhood kids, controlled his social life with care, and constantly reminded him that he was different from the people around him. Harold absorbed all of it. He grew up believing it. He passed his 11+ exam and won a place at a prestigious grammar school in 1957, a genuine achievement for a boy from his background, and he carried himself through those school years with the same quiet distance he had always maintained. Classmates remembered him as serious and mature, and not particularly easy to get close to. On the sports field, he came alive, a strong distance runner and a capable rugby player. But the moment the game ended, he retreated back behind the wall. He kept around himself, as if the social ease he showed in competition was a tool he only picked up when it served a purpose. On June 21, 1960, Harold's mother passed away after a serious illness. She was 43 years old. Harold was 17. Vera had kept the illness secret from almost everyone. The diagnosis came only weeks before her death and was already advanced illness by the time anyone outside the family knew about it. Harold's father worked long-distance trucking and could not stop. His older sister had moved out. His younger brother was 13. So it was Harold who arranged the appointments, managed the schedule, sat at the bedside, and watched the family doctor arrive night after night with an injection and administer pain relief injections that took the pain away and left Vera peaceful, quieter still. Harold watched this happen again and again, He watched what strong pain medication did. He noticed the exact moment the relief arrived. When Vera finally passed, Harold went for a run, not a short one. He ran for hours in the pouring rain, alone in the dark, and he ran through it until something in him shifted. The following Monday, he told a classmate almost in passing that his mother had died over the weekend. The classmate fumbled for words. Harold said he had gone for a run. After her death, Harold decided he wanted to become a doctor. He had shown no interest in medicine before that. The connection between what he had witnessed at Vera's bedside and the direction he chose afterward was something investigators and psychologists would spend decades examining without ever fully resolving. Harold's grades were not strong enough for immediate entry into Leeds Medical School. He failed on his first attempt and retook his exams, eventually gaining admission in 1965. On a bus to campus one morning, he met a young woman named Primrose Huxtable. She was warm and free-spirited and had left school at 15. They began dating, and within 6 months she was pregnant. For a working-class family in 1960s, England, this was serious. Harold was barely 20. There was no celebration, no photographs. They were married quietly at a register office and got on with it. Primrose would go on to have 4 children with Harold and would stay beside him with a loyalty so complete that even what came later did not break it. But while Harold played the role of responsible husband and diligent student, he was carrying something no one around him knew about. Since his teenage years, he had been using substances to manage physical pain from running, progressing through various products until he reached strong pain medication. Once his medical training gave him access to it, the moment he learned to give injections, he began using it on himself. Harold Shipman was dependent on pain medication and had been for years before anyone found out. By 1970, Harold had his medical certificate and moved to Pontefract General Infirmary for his junior doctor training. He found the environment difficult. He was at the bottom of the hierarchy and had no autonomy, and he pushed hard to move up and out. It was during this period that the first suspicious case appeared in the record. A 4-year-old girl was seriously ill and in serious pain. Her mother had been at her bedside every day. On one particular afternoon, the mother stepped out briefly to get tea at the hospital cafe. She told the young doctor on her way out to please be kind to her daughter. When she returned, the girl had passed away. No investigation followed. Harold signed the paperwork and moved on. That case would not be looked at seriously until decades later, when investigators went back through every death connected to Harold Shipman's career and tried to understand where it had actually begun. By 1977, after a scandal in a previous post that will be addressed shortly, Harold had been accepted as a general practitioner at the Donnybrook Medical Centre in Hyde, Greater Manchester. Hyde was a small, close-knit town of about 30,000 people where neighbours knew each other and where a doctor's word carried absolute weight. Harold's patient list was predominantly elderly women living alone, and he had a manner with them that no one who observed it ever forgot. He was patient. He was attentive. He remembered the names of their grandchildren, their cats, the things they worried about. He visited them at home when other doctors would have required them to come in. Some patients described getting onto his list as something they felt genuinely fortunate about. Some dressed in their finest clothes when he came over. Some gave him keys to their homes because they trusted him that completely. This was not accidental. Harold had understood since childhood how to perform warmth and connection when he needed to. In Hyde, he switched it on and left it on, and the community wrapped itself around him. The deaths began quietly. An elderly woman found at home, fully dressed, seated in a chair or on a sofa, looking peaceful. No signs of distress, no obvious cause beyond old age. Harold would arrive, assess the scene briefly, and certify the death before returning to the surgery. Sometimes he altered records on his computer that same afternoon, adding details of illnesses and symptoms that the patient's file had not previously contained, constructing a history that explained what had happened in case anyone looked closely. He encouraged families toward cremation, in most cases, gently and practically, and most of them agreed because he was their doctor and they trusted him, and it was easier. From the late 1970s through the 1980s and into the 1990s, the deaths climbed. Some weeks saw more than one. Some months were quiet. The number passed 100, then 150. Within closed circles in Hyde, a nickname began to move through conversations held quietly behind doors. A dark nickname circulated privately, but no one said it where it could go anywhere, because accusing the most beloved doctor in town was not something that could be done lightly, and the cost of being wrong was one that no one wanted to bear. Before Hyde, Harold had practiced in Todmorden, Yorkshire, where his patients adored him and his colleagues had serious concerns. He refused to let nurses give injections on his behalf. He refused to let visiting technicians take blood samples from his patients. Every procedure involving an injection, Harold insisted on handling personally. His colleagues found this difficult to work around, but his patients interpreted it as dedication, and their loyalty to him made it nearly impossible for anyone inside the practice to raise concerns without appearing to be the unreasonable party. Then a colleague made a visit to the hospital pharmacy and began going through the prescribing records. What she found was a pattern of over-prescribing a powerful painkiller called pethidine, with the excess quantities unaccounted for. The forgeries in the prescription records made the picture clear. When confronted, Harold admitted what he had been doing. His boss let him go immediately. In 1975, Harold was convicted of drug-related offenses, prescribing misconduct, and document fraud. His medical license was not taken. His fine was £600. He spent time in a rehabilitation centre and then applied for a new position, walking into his interview at Donnybrook and volunteering his history before they could raise it themselves. He said he had been under enormous stress. He said he was completely clean. He said he just needed another chance. They believed him and gave him the job. In early 1998, 6 of Harold's patients passed away in the space of 25 days. All elderly women, all found at home, fully dressed, seated peacefully, apparently gone without any struggle or visible cause. A funeral director named Debbie Massey and her father Alan had been quietly keeping count of the deaths coming from Harold's practice, and the numbers compared with every other practice in Hyde were not close to normal. Debbie shared her concerns with a doctor at Brook Surgery, across the street named Sue Booth, who took them to her colleague, Dr. Linda Reynolds. Dr. Reynolds had been doing something quietly for some time. She had been tracking how many cremation authorization forms she was signing for Harold's patients, compared with any other doctor she had worked alongside, and the number was not explainable by anything routine. Brook Surgery served 10,000 patients and had issued 14 cremation requests in the preceding months. Harold's surgery served 3,000 patients and had issued 41. 3 times fewer patients, nearly 3 times as many cremation requests. When those figures were placed side by side, the gap was not something that could be explained away by coincidence or by differences in patient age or health. Dr. Reynolds took her findings to the local coroner on March 24, 1998. The coroner brought in the police. Investigators began working through the records. Within a few weeks, they concluded there was nothing actionable. One officer reportedly told Dr. Reynolds to be careful about what she said about a pillar of the community. Harold Shipman continued seeing patients. 3 more of his patients found dead before the next alarm was raised, and this time it could not be set aside. On June 24, 1998, Harold arrived at the home of Kathleen Grundy, She was 81 years old, a former mayor of Hyde, deeply respected across the community, and in excellent health for her age. She adored Harold and trusted him completely. The appointment was for a routine blood test. She had a pensioner's luncheon planned for 11. There was nothing about that morning that would have felt different from any other visit he had made to her home over the years. By late morning, her colleagues at the luncheon were trying to reach her. By the afternoon, 2 of them went to her home and found her on her sofa, fully dressed, gone. Harold arrived, looked at her briefly, and recorded the cause of death as old age. That same day, a local solicitor's firm called Hamilton Ward received an unsolicited letter containing a will signed in Kathleen's name. The will directed that her entire estate be given to her doctor. Her doctor, of course, was Harold Shipman. It was typed in capital letters, filled with grammatical errors, and accompanied by a brief note from a person who signed only as S. or F. Smith, explaining that this friend had typed the will on Kathleen's behalf. Hamilton Ward sent a copy to Kathleen's daughter, Angela Woodruff. Angela was a solicitor. She had been holding her mother's actual will for a decade, handwritten, careful, entirely leaving everything to Angela. She looked at the new document and understood immediately that it was not her mother's work. The grammar was wrong, the format was wrong. Kathleen would never have used a typewriter for something like this, and her second property in Stockport was not mentioned anywhere, an omission her mother would never have made. Angela went to the police. The police began with the blood test. There was no record of any sample from Kathleen Grundy ever arriving at the laboratory that day. The appointment Harold had scheduled as his reason for being in her home had produced nothing. No sample, no record, nothing. Forensic examination of a typewriter recovered from Harold's surgery confirmed it was the same machine used to produce Kathleen's forged will. 2 witnesses, whose signatures appeared on the document, confirmed they had signed what Harold handed them in his waiting room, believing it was a routine medical form. Neither had known what it actually was. Harold's fingerprints were on the will. When asked, he said he had never seen it. Kathleen's family gave permission for her body to be later examined after burial. The post-mortem examination found levels of diamorphine in her system so high they would have been well above a survivable level. Kathleen had no medical condition that required such treatment. She had never been prescribed it. She had been perfectly healthy. On September 7, 1998, Harold Shipman walked voluntarily into the police station, apparently confident he could manage whatever was coming. He was cold and dismissive toward the investigators throughout the early questioning. When they put evidence in front of him, he responded with no comment. At one point, he told them that they did not understand medical matters, that they were only police. He sat in that room as though the entire proceeding was beneath him, as though the people across the table were simply not equipped to hold a conversation with someone of his standing. Then they showed him his computer records. Harold had been routinely altering patient files after deaths, backdating symptoms and illnesses to explain what had happened. He had believed he had done this cleanly. What he had not known was that his computer system kept an automatic audit log recording exactly when every change was made. The record of those alterations, laid out in sequence, made the pattern impossible to argue with. When the investigators put that evidence in front of him, Harold dropped to his knees and told his lawyers he was unfit to continue. He was formally charged in relation to those deaths of Joan Malia, Winifred Meller, and Bianca Pomfrey. The bodies of all 3 were later examined after burial. The post-mortem examination returned the same finding every time. Harold's trial began on January 31st, 2000, at Preston Crown Court. By this point, Hyde had been through something it would not recover from quickly. Patients who had defended him, who had said it was impossible and that he was the kindest doctor they had ever had slowly come to sit with the evidence and found that there was no version of it that left room for anything except what it plainly showed. Harold maintained his innocence through every day of the proceedings. He offered no explanation, no expression, no acknowledgement of the families sitting in the same room watching him. When the details of each victim's final hours were read into the record, he sat still and gave back nothing. The jury deliberated for 6 days and returned a verdict of guilty on all 15 counts and guilty on 1 count for Kathleen Grundy's fraudulent will. Harold Shipman was subjected to life sentence. The judge told him directly that he would never be released. Primrose had stood beside him through the entire trial. She never publicly accepted what the evidence showed. Harold never gave her or anyone else an explanation for any of it. The inquiry and the real number. Following the conviction, a major public inquiry was launched, led by Dame Janet Smith, to establish the full extent of what Harold had done. The Shipman inquiry eventually documented 284 confirmed cases. The true number remains unknown because Harold had persuaded families toward cremation in so many instances that the physical evidence was gone. The 15 deaths proven in court represented only the cases where bodies had been buried and could still be examined. Harold Shipman served less than 4 years of his life sentence. On the morning of January 13, 2004, prison staff at Wakefield Prison checked on him at 5 a.m. and found him alive. The next scheduled check was 1 hour away. Harold was a doctor. He understood time and dosage and the body's limits better than almost anyone. He was found dead in his cell in 2004, and when staff returned at 6, he was gone. He was 57 years old. 1 day before his 58th birthday, his wife Primrose received a pension benefit that the rules would not have extended had he passed away after that birthday. Some investigators believe Harold had worked this out deliberately, ensuring that even in his final act, he was providing for his family and keeping control of the outcome until the very last moment. He took with him every answer he had never given, every name he had never acknowledged, every family that had waited for him to explain and received nothing. The warning signs were there throughout his career. In 1975, Harold Shipman was caught in Todmorden for prescription forgery and drug misuse. He was convicted, fined, sent for treatment, and still allowed to continue practicing medicine. Years later, concerns surfaced again. In 1997, a funeral director noticed unusual patterns in deaths linked to Shipman's patients and raised the alarm. Nothing changed. The concerns were noted, but not acted on strongly enough to stop him. By early 1998, a doctor had already compiled clear data showing something unusual. Shipman's cremation rates were far higher than other doctors in the area. The patterns stood out clearly when compared side by side with normal practices. This information was taken to a coroner, and police were informed. Still, the case was initially downplayed, and no urgent action followed. At every stage, concern was slowed by hesitation, reputation, and trust in his professional image. Shipman was seen as a respected family doctor, and that trust made it difficult for others to immediately accept the pattern forming in front of them. Looking back, the signals were not hidden. They were simply not acted on in time. The most dangerous deception is the one that wears the face of someone you trust completely, and understanding that is the first step toward making sure it never happens again. If this story changed the way you think about blind trust and the importance of systems that ask questions even when it is uncomfortable, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and stay with us, because every case we cover here is one more reason to stay informed, stay aware, and never stop asking questions. Now, let's move on to the third horrifying serial killer story. On the morning of March 9th, 1980, a man in the Ecuadorian city of Ambato was selling small trinkets at a public market. Chains, little locks. He had been there since early morning. He has been watching, quietly patiently. He has done this before, many times, in many towns, in many countries. Then a mother noticed where his eyes were. The child was 11 years old. Vendors surrounded him before he could leave. Police arrived and took him in. What he told investigators over the days that followed did not seem possible for one person to have done. He did not admit to a few cases. He led officers, shackled in leg irons, to location after location across 3 countries. And when they asked for a total, he said hundreds. He said it without hesitation. This is the story of Pedro Alonso López. Pedro Alonso López came into the world on October 8, 1948, in the Tolima region of Colombia, at one of the worst possible moments in that country's modern history. Colombia was at war with itself. The period historians would come to call La Violencia, a civil conflict between the country's 2 main political factions, had begun that same year and would run until 1958. An estimated 200,000 people died during those 10 years. Entire villages were destroyed. Families were torn apart. Thousands of children were left with no parents, no home, and no sense that the world around them operated by any dependable rules at all. Pedro's father, Medardo Reyes, was already gone before Pedro was born. He had been part of the conflict and lost his life before his son ever drew a first breath. His mother, Benilda Lopez de Castañeda, was 3 months pregnant and suddenly alone, responsible for a growing number of children with almost nothing to provide for them. She turned to the only work she could find. Men paid to visit the home. A thin curtain divided the room. On one side, their mother and paying visitors. On the other side, her children, hearing adult activity night after night, understanding more than any child should ever have to understand. Benilda was not a gentle person. Neighbors described her as someone with a sharp and unpredictable temper who was physically harsh with her children. Pedro, one of 13, was frequently on the receiving end. The house was never a refuge. It was simply a place where pain arrived regularly and without warning. Pedro later said he never knew what tenderness felt like. He said he did not know what it meant to be protected by someone whose job it was to protect you. When Pedro was around 8 or 9 years old, he was caught in inappropriate conduct involving a younger sibling. His mother punished him severely and removed him from the household entirely, placing him on a bus that traveled hundreds of miles from home. A child, alone, with nowhere to go and no one expecting him. He ended up in Bogotá. The capital in the late 1950s had thousands of homeless children sleeping under bridges, searching through garbage for food, and forming loose groups simply to survive. Pedro joined them. He learned quickly that softness cost you everything, and that the only language that worked reliably on the street was the one you could enforce. He also started using a highly addictive street drug, a crude, highly addictive substance made from a crude, cocaine-derived substance. It was cheap, it was everywhere among the street children of Bogotá, and it produced the kind of paranoia and disconnection that rarely loosened its hold once it had one. He was not safe on the street. Adults who exploited at-risk children were not uncommon. A man offered him food and a place to sleep. Pedro accepted. The man took him to an abandoned building and abused him. It was not the only time he experienced abuse during those years. Each time it did, something inside him moved further from anything resembling ordinary feeling. At around 10 years old, an American couple found him and took him in. They gave him a bed, regular meals, and enrolled him in school. For the first time in his life, something resembling normal was within reach. It did not hold. By 12, he had taken money from the school and walked back out into the street. He would not come close to a normal life again. For the years that followed, Pedro survived on petty crime. By his late teens, he had moved into vehicle theft, selling them to operations that paid for whatever he brought in. In 1969, around 21 years old, He was caught and sentenced to 7 years. Colombian prisons in that era were not places of rehabilitation. They were overcrowded, effectively run by the inmates themselves, and entirely indifferent to what happened to new arrivals who came in without protection or reputation. Pedro arrived thin, nervous, and visibly vulnerable. To the harder men inside, he looked like a straightforward target. He was abused within days of arriving. Rather than report it, the authorities would almost certainly have done nothing. He waited. Over the following 2 weeks, he made a makeshift tool from materials available in the cell block. Then, one by one, found the men responsible. 3 later died. The prison inquiry ruled the deaths as self-defense in an environment where such outcomes were routine. 2 additional years were added to his sentence. Nobody approached him after that. He later described what he felt when it was over. Not guilt, not fear, something he called recognition. He later claimed it changed how he saw himself, like finding something he had not known he was looking for. He walked out of prison in 1978 with no job, no plan, and a very clear sense of what came next. Pedro did not return to Bogota after his release. He drifted south, crossed the Andes, and entered Peru. What happened there across the years that followed is difficult to fully account for, because almost none of it was ever officially recorded. He later claimed to have taken the lives of more than 100 girls in Peru alone. The number cannot be independently verified, but the pattern of missing children from indigenous communities in the Ayacucho region during those years is consistent with what he described. Families reported daughters who had gone to markets and not come home. Police filed the reports and then did almost nothing, attributing disappearances to trafficking networks already known to operate in the region. Pedro had chosen his approach carefully. He approached children between 8 and 12, roughly the same age he had been when his own life came apart. He looked for children who were already on the margins, street children, children from poor and indigenous families, children whose disappearances would draw the least attention from the institutions meant to investigate such things. His method was precise and consistent. He would find a child at a market who had a quality he described as innocence. He would approach her, offer something small, a mirror, a trinket, and try to lead her away from the crowd. If her mother was close, he would wait. He sometimes followed a family for days before the right moment opened. He was methodical. He had learned patience the hard way and applied it to everything. He said he always waited for sunrise before the crime was completed. He needed to see the children, those affected. He said doing it in the dark would have been a waste. That detail, the insistence on daylight, on watching, is not the detail of someone acting on impulse. It is the detail of someone following a repeated pattern and followed it every single time. His time in Peru came close to ending when he was caught attempting to take a girl from a community in the Ayacucho region. Members of the community pursued him, cornered him, and decided to handle the matter themselves. They physically attacked him, buried him in the ground up to his neck, and covered him in a sugary substance with the intention of leaving him exposed to the elements. An American missionary passing through persuaded them to hand him over to the authorities instead. Peruvian police received him. They conducted no investigation into the accusations the community had brought. Because the complaints came from indigenous villagers, they were set aside without serious consideration. The police quietly deported Pedro back to Colombia. He continued. The same pattern followed him across Colombia and then into Ecuador. Town to town, market to market. The same patients, the same small gifts, the same outcome. He later claimed that at the height of his activity, he was linked to 2 or 3 deaths a week. He said he had accounted for around 100 in Colombia, then around 100 more in Ecuador. Added to Peru, His claim total sat well above 300. He was not chaotic or impulsive about any of it. He varied his routes so that no single area accumulated enough disappearances to force a serious response. When whispers in one community grew too loud, he moved on to somewhere new, somewhere the warnings had not yet traveled. His mobility was his most effective protection. In a region already drowning in violence from civil conflicts, cartels, and trafficking operations, one more stream of missing girls from poor and indigenous families was easy for authorities to absorb into existing explanations. By late 1979 and into early 1980, the area around Ambato in the Ecuadorian Andes had become a place where parents could feel something was badly wrong. Daughters had been disappearing for months. Families organized their own searches. Missing child posters lined the walls of shops. Mothers began escorting their daughters in pairs just to reach the market and back. Police attributed the disappearances to trafficking. For the families who had been trying to get someone to take their report seriously, that response was an insult added to a loss they had not yet been given space to grieve openly. Then, in early March 1980, heavy rain flooded the rivers around Ambato. When the water receded, it uncovered what the police had been insisting was not there: evidence linked to 4 missing girls in shallow graves near the riverbank, each showing the same signs of what they had been through before they died. On March 8th, the remains of 9-year-old Ivanova Zhikom, the daughter of a well-known local baker who had gone missing in February, was found in a barn outside town. The circumstances matched the earlier cases, the 4 found by the flooding exactly. The next day, at Plaza Urbina, a man selling trinkets reached for an 11-year-old girl named Alicia. Her mother, Carlina Ramon Poveda, saw it happen. Vendors surrounded him before he reached the exit. Police arrived and took him in. When officers brought Pedro Alonso López into the station, he was incoherent, rambling. He appeared at first like someone who had lost his grip on reality entirely. He seemed too disorganized, too erratic, to be the person behind the scale of what investigators were now beginning to understand. He refused to speak. He answered no questions. He denied everything. Days passed, and he remained completely silent. Investigators eventually tried a different approach. Background research on Pedro suggested he considered himself a devoted Catholic, so they placed an undercover officer, Captain Pastor Gonzalez, into his cell, posing as a fellow inmate arrested for similar offenses, someone Pedro might feel understood by. It took time, but Pedro began to talk, and once he started, what came out of him was so detailed, so specific, and described on such a scale that Captain Gonzalez spent every night in that cell with a towel quietly wrapped around his throat, afraid that at any moment Pedro might realize the deception and act before Gonzalez could call for help. When Gonzalez walked out of that cell, colleagues described him as visibly changed. He told them what Pedro had described was far worse than he expected. The total number of girls Pedro claimed to have taken the lives of across Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru was well above 300. When Pedro was told his cellmate had been a police officer all along, he did not withdraw a single word. He told investigators that if they doubted him, he would show them. Over the following 6 weeks, shackled in leg irons and dressed in a police uniform to protect him from the crowds that gathered at every stop, Pedro led investigators into the mountains, through open fields, along riverbeds across the Andes. He pointed, they dug. Across those weeks, investigators recovered the remains of 53 girls in Ecuador alone. Many had been placed together in the same shallow sites, exactly as he had described in the cell. Pedro also directed officers to roughly 30 additional locations where nothing was found, most likely because the recent flooding or animals had already disturbed whatever had been placed there. At one point, he reached down, handled one victim's remains, and asked to be photographed with them. They refused. He stopped cooperating eventually, simply grew tired of the process and said nothing more. By then, the evidence had long passed the point of any doubt. Victor Lascano, the governor of Ambato prison, later said he believed Pedro's own estimate of 300 was probably too low. On July 31st, 1981, Pedro Alonso López stood before a courtroom crowded with journalists and the families of victims and entered a guilty plea. He was convicted of 110 cases in Ecuador, the 53 found during the 6-week search, the 4 uncovered by the flooding, and additional cases confirmed through the investigation. He was given the maximum sentence allowed under Ecuadorian law, 16 years. That was the ceiling. Not because of anything specific to Pedro's case, not because there was any doubt about what he had done or how many times he had done it, because Ecuador had abolished the death penalty over a century earlier, and the law set a fixed maximum regardless of how many victims were involved. 1 case or 100, the cap was the same. There was no mechanism to extend it. Families were devastated. A reward of $25,000 was placed on Pedro's head by relatives of victims who had no faith the outcome would hold. To keep him safe from anyone willing to collect, he was held in near-total isolation in a remote section of the prison for most of his sentence. He showed no remorse. Psychiatrists who assessed him concluded he had a severe antisocial personality disorder and was entirely without empathy. He smoked. He said very little. He gave no indication that the weight of what he had done meant anything to him at all. In 1992, a journalist named Ron Leitner received the only formal interview Pedro had agreed to give during his imprisonment. Before it could take place, Pedro made a request. He said he had not been in contact with a woman in nearly 12 years and would only speak after a disturbing personal request involving the director's adult daughter. Guards raised their weapons. The director's daughter stepped forward and extended her hands. Pedro took them, ran his fingers slowly along her wrists, and then released her. He told Leitner afterward that at 26, she was outside the age range he fixated on. During the interview, Pedro spoke openly and without hesitation. He called himself the man of the century. He referred to the girls in dehumanizing terms. He said he had been sparing them from suffering. He announced, without any pause, that the moment he was free, he intended to feel that same moment again. He called it his mission. He said he would be happy to continue. On August 31st, 1994, 2 years before his sentence was even finished, released for recorded good conduct, Pedro Alonso López walked out of Garcia Moreno prison. The reaction across Ecuador was immediate and furious. Authorities escorted him directly to the Colombian border and expelled him before anyone could reach him. In Colombia, prosecutors had been building a case for years. Unlike Ecuador, a conviction there could mean the rest of his life behind bars. They took him into custody, reviewed old case files, and linked him to cases in the Tolima region from the late 1970s. Then, in 1995, a Colombian court declared him legally unfit to stand trial and transferred him to a psychiatric facility in Bogotá. 3 years later, in February 1998, a second evaluation reversed the first. He was declared fully competent and fit for release. The conditions placed on his freedom were barely believable. A bond equivalent to roughly $50, a requirement to check in with authorities once a month, a recommendation to continue psychiatric care. He paid the bond. He walked out into open air for the second time as a free man, with no supervision, no monitoring system, and no one watching where he went. He never checked in. He never received any follow-up of any kind. No one confirmed his address. No monitoring of any kind ever took place. A man who had confessed to hundreds of children's deaths was processed on conditions you might attach to a parking violation, and then forgotten entirely. By the time officials noticed he had stopped complying, he was already gone. The final confirmed record of Pedro Alonso López is a routine government transaction dated September 22, 1999. He appeared at an office in Bogotá to renew his national identity card. A clerk processed the form. He signed. He walked out. No alert was triggered. No officer connected the name on the document to the files that existed underneath it. He moved through the building like any other citizen and stepped back into the street. After that day, nothing. Carlina Ramón Poveda, the woman whose instincts at Plaza Urbina 19 years earlier had led to his arrest, spoke to reporters in the years that followed. She said she believed someone had found him, that the families who had waited through a failed trial, a capped sentence, a psychiatric loophole, and a $50 bond had eventually delivered the outcome the courts never managed. She hoped he had been stopped for good. Others believed he had returned to the mountains of Colombia, to the region where he was born, and simply folded back into the noise and disorder that had always provided him cover. In 2002, 2 new cases in the Tolima region, details consistent with his known approach, prompted Colombian authorities to request an Interpol arrest notice. Officers across 3 countries began carrying his photograph again. Tips came in. Nothing was confirmed. In 2005, the notice was quietly closed without resolution. A case in Tunya, Colombia, in 2012. A case involving the death of a 12-year-old girl in a manner consistent with every detail Pedro had described in his confession, put his name back briefly into the news. No official link was ever made. His mother, in her later years, told reporters she was certain he was still alive. She said every other relative she had lost had made their presence felt in some way after passing. Pedro never had. She said she knew somehow that he was still out there. What those who have studied his case say consistently is this: the kind of compulsion Pedro exhibited does not simply stop. It does not quiet down with age or circumstance. Such behavior typically ends only with permanent restraint or death. Whether that happened, and when, and precisely how it ended, belongs to the same silence that has surrounded him since that afternoon in Bogotá, when he signed a government form and walked into a city that let him go without a second glance. The children Pedro targeted were dismissed because of who they were. Be the voice for the overlooked in your community, because silence is exactly what allows harm to continue unseen. If this story stayed with you, share it so more people understand how systems fail the most vulnerable and why those failures carry consequences that last for generations. Subscribe so we can keep bringing forward the cases that never received the attention they truly deserved. Because every name in every story here matters, and none of them should ever be forgotten. Stay watchful, stay informed, and always remember that awareness is the first and most lasting protection we can offer to the people around us.